Good day. This is another series on Chautauqua Lake, past, present, and future. Today we are going to struggle with that period from the year 14,000 to 12,000 before present up to the year 1749. The reason for picking these dates, somewhere between 12 and 14,000 years ago, the glaciers left the Chautauqua Lake Valley. And 1749 is the first detailed writing that we have about Chautauqua Lake. The writings come from an 1878 American history publication which interprets the work from the original papers of Celeron's exploration of the area. Realize that we have to really use our imagination to be involved with these time periods. I don't know, I have no comprehension of what I'm dealing with, but I'm sharing with you something that I think is extremely exciting. And I would like to turn to the topo map on the wall to give you an idea of what I'm talking about when we look at the year 14 or 12,000 before present. Here we have before us the watershed of Chautauqua Lake. We're dealing with an area within the black line of 180.5 square miles with a 13,000 acre lake lying in a valley, the bottom of the watershed, with the water flowing in this direction. Realize that we don't have measurable flow. We can't really see it flowing, but we know it goes in that direction. As the glaciers retreated and left us basically the topography that we are dealing with today, because man has modified it in a very, very limited manner, we have some interesting things. As the last glacier movement came along and plugged up the end of this valley, which may have been as much as 700 feet deeper than it is today, it left us an interesting feature. Up in the town of Portland, and up through the town of Chautauqua, and around over past Summerdale, and over into the town of Sherman, we have a continental divide. It divides the water flowing northward into the Great Lakes, down the St. Lawrence, and into the Atlantic Ocean. Whereas if you get just south of Gravitz Apple Orchard, for those of us that have been around long enough to know that it was Gravitz Apple Orchard, the water flows into Chautauqua Lake. Then, interestingly enough, it flows into the Chautauqua River, which then flows into the Cassadaga Creek, which flows into the Conowongo Creek, into the Allegheny, to the Ohio, the Mississippi, and the Gulf of Mexico. So we have a spectacular thing here. We have a continental divide. However, it's not as spectacular as the one that we see in the West, and we haven't figured out how to develop it into some type of a dynamic tourist attraction. There is no place along this line that any municipality has posted a sign to say, you are crossing a continental divide. What does it mean? It means all of the water this way goes one direction and all of the water that way goes in another direction. As we look at the history of the county, or the history of northeastern United States, I would refer you to several other people in Chautauqua County for some of the details and some of the romance and some of the myths. I can't help but believe that you have to, at some point, if you have the opportunity, listen to a presentation made by Norman Carlson. He has just done several presentations for the Fenton Historical Society. You've got to find Norton's notes on steamboating and fishing on Chautauqua Lake. Very exciting. I believe there's some other time I'll give you the proper title, but The Great White Ships of Chautauqua Lake, done by another author. All kinds of wonderful things that we could get into. But I'm going to deal with prehistory, and the reason I mentioned Norman Carlson is because he has done an analysis of each one of the people that have ever drawn a map about Chautauqua County, and he's come to the conclusion as to whether or not that person was really in the county or not. I'm not going to get into that that much of a detail, because what I'm interested in this series of presentations is Chautauqua Lake. And when is the first time we get information that is going to be of use to us in understanding Chautauqua Lake? And we don't get any written history until the notes on Celeron's expedition in July of 1749. However, before that, the area was dynamically occupied. It was occupied by the Native Americans. We believe, based on archaeological work that has been done in the county, that man may have been wandering Chautauqua County as much as 10,000 years ago. There are several places in Chautauqua County where they have recovered Clovis points. These Clovis points are associated with the migration over the Bering Sea from Russia. We don't have real good carbon dating, but I am willing to concede that it could very well be that we had people around the shores of Chautauqua Lake as much as 10,000 years ago. And these were very intelligent people. Professor White at the University of Buffalo suggested that any soils in Chautauqua County that are well drained and on a slope of less than 8% should be classified as archaeologically sensitive. A high probability that Native Americans occupied and used the area. We find a number of recording opportunities. I don't have them in my bibliography. One of the things about archaeology in Chautauqua County, particularly that of more recent times, is the people that are involved in it guard it very, very jealously, because there has been so much plundering of archaeological remains, and that's about the only way to describe it. The other thing is that if you read an original source document, such as I did about burials that were opened in the vicinity of Sinclairville, they noted that one of the skeletons was of a person of over 6 feet in height. And by the time you get 3 references away, they talk about a tribe of giants whose bodies were unearthed in Sinclairville. So we have those types of things to deal with when we go back into prehistory, so to speak. We also have the story of the total elimination of a tribe of Indians that basically occupied most of Chautauqua County sometime in prehistory. There are at least 2 master's theses that have been written on that topic, and in both instances they claim that the Native Americans made these up to try and prevent the French and the English from occupying the area. That the Native Americans wanted to show that they were so fierce that European man oughtn't to come into the area. Now, whether or not I have just created a new myth about Chautauqua County or not, I don't know. But take it as some reference material that is out there that deals with that particular topic. When we get into the work that was done by the Rochester Institute and other of the amateur archaeologists of Chautauqua County, we find some very interesting references. They talk about banks of Indian artifacts behind Dwittville. They talk about Indian village sites here and there. We don't have maps of those things because the people that are involved in it don't want to direct people to them to disturb what might be there. Because as we learn more about how to do archaeological interpretation, we find that such things as pollen and seed that are at these sites that a typical person rummaging through them wouldn't be sensitive to might be important to help make the interpretation. To give you an idea of how the archaeologists feel about this, in the construction of the Southern Tier Expressway through the town of Ellery in Chautauqua Lake, they literally marked out an Indian settlement site and said it's better off that we not salvage it, we'll bury it and record its dimensions, and some other time someone with more sophisticated ability can come back and look at this particular site. Let me take you to places that you know about and that you walk on, though, possibly, and talk about Indian settlement. The shores of Chautauqua Lake have indications of occupation in many, many places. Bemis Point in Oriental Park. When we were doing the Cultural Resource Survey for the Center Chautauqua Lake Sewer District, we did a dig right in the middle of the park to the west of the, and a little bit to the south of the tennis courts and toward the casino. There are 32 inches of stratified Indian remains there. Basically, the majority of them deal with the woodland period, which is a period that only extends back several thousands of years. We were able to define this. It was a pottery site. We found 32 balls of clay with shells in them as a tempering agent. And apparently they were going to make pots out of them. We also found drill bits, all types of points, a lot of fire-cracked rock, and a lot of broken pottery. We've never been able to do in the Bemis Point Park what we wanted to. But if we go back and look at the early notes, when Celeron comes through, the description is very brief. We don't cover but 2 pages in a document. And they talk about the struggle up the escarpment and sending the troops up to cut the Portage Road, which, by the way, becomes historically the first, one of the first north-south roads of Chautauqua County, from Westfield up to the head of Chautauqua Lake. They talk about several days getting up that distance in the cutting of the road. Then they talk about a day trip coming down, and someplace in this portion of the lake, we don't know where, they say 3 miles above, they spent the night. And then they traveled on down to the outlet, which they described as, remember it's July, very shallow, very difficult to navigate, trees and logs across, an over-towering canopy of trees. And then they talk about the difficulty of going down through the rapids and how they portaged part of their cargo down around the rapids. What do they tell us about the lake? They tell us that basically, as far as they were concerned, the shoreline of the lake was totally forested. The Native Americans, they saw some canoes, but they didn't get into any personal contact with the Native Americans that were here. And that's it. That's all we know. And that's the first writing that I can find about the lake. But now let's go back and look at the archaeological work that's been done. One of the things that happened when we went to put together the North Chautauqua Lake Sewer District, which serves from this area here, Galloway Road, all the way around to the institution and then down to the Pendergast Fish Hatchery for the North Chautauqua Lake Sewer District, and then from Midway Park all the way down the east side of the lake, down through here, and from Asheville Bay back to Celeron. In order for us to receive the federal grants, we had to do a cultural resource study, which meant that we had to hire archaeologists to go out and look at the topography and basically do an 18-inch dig shovel test every 100 feet along all of the sewer lines that we were going to install in order to find out if we were going to be involved with any prehistorical settlement. The other thing that happened, of course, is when people found out that we were involved in this, we began to get word-of-mouth stories. Some of my friends talk about when they were children going up in the vicinity of the Lawndale Trailer Park, just south of Lighthouse Point, and when that was a field, picking up all kinds of Indian artifacts in that particular area. I have been told time and time again that somebody collected bushel baskets full of Indian artifacts and they have them at their house. Well, I went to some of the old families. One of them was the Hamming family, at the end of Maple Drive East because supposedly he had bushel baskets of material and he had nothing. The only place that I did find literally bushel baskets of material around the shores of Chautauqua Lake that I'm cognizant of was down on the Loomis farm, down on Goose Creek, and I'll show you where that is on this map. We're dealing with this area of the lake, and this is the Loomis farm, and a very interesting piece of land use. I could do a whole presentation on the Stan Loomis development at the mouth of Goose Creek. They literally had mortars and pestles and all types of Indian artifacts. The fact is that when we put the sewer line through this particular area, or we designed to put it through, one archaeological team felt that the garden across from Stan Loomis's house ought to be on the National Register of Historic Places, i.e. you cannot put your sewer line through there. We didn't work with that archaeologist for too long. Eventually we brought in another archaeological team, and they said the work that the first team had done had salvaged that whole particular site. The second team identified the activity at Bemis Point, and I dug with those people for several days on my hands and knees with a trowel and a brush and a pick, finding the things that were there. They proposed this for nomination to the Historical Register. At the time that the Historical Register process was taking place in Washington, the head of the first team was the chief person deciding whether or not a site should be registered, and they said, we're sorry, but that's not a significant site. So even in archaeology, we have the problem of politics. But we do have a record of the earlier settlers talking about a plum tree orchard back in through here, a burial ground, and a tremendous number of amount of Indian evidence. One of the other things is when we look at Heath's notes, these are basically up in the McClurg Library in Westfield, we find that when he draws the area of Dutch Hollow Creek and the Sheldon Hall area and Point Stockholm, he doesn't have Dutch Hollow Creek going straight out into the lake. He has it bending over and coming out at Point Stockholm. And he illustrates all of the rest of the area there as being Indian fields, that there was still evidence when he arrived that they were raising corn, they were raising squash and other plants as a cultivating activity, which is contrary to what Celeron talked about, because Celeron talked about the fact that it was forested down to the shoreline. Well, it very well may be that as they were plying the lake and dealing with their canoes, they really didn't have an opportunity to look deeply in back of maybe the first row of trees. I would suggest to you, if you want an interesting comparison, there are a number of historical texts, and I just came upon a text, a photo of artistic renderings called Early Chautauqua, and it shows the hills of Chautauqua Lake basically barren. And we'll talk more about that at another time in the session where we go into what happens when European man comes to the area. Tom's Point, even today, if you want to go out there after they plow the field of Tom's Point, you can find artifacts. Art Thomas and his boys, Art Thomas was the town justice, may still be the town justice of North Harmony. He and his sons collected a substantial number of artifacts in this particular area. There's almost no place in the lower lake where you have well-drained soils that you are not dealing with the probability that you're dealing with a place where early Americans were involved with the waters of Chautauqua Lake. If you begin to read Hazeltine and the history of Chautauqua County, he refers to burial grounds on the south side of the Chautauqua River, but it's an offhanded reference. I have no doubt that when you get down into the moraine area at the lower end of the lake where it was well drained, that the Indians used it. There are a number of other places that I've encountered archaeological evidence of occupancy. I'm involved with the Jamestown Audubon, and it just so happens to the east of that site is where two of the Clovis points, which would indicate the earliest occupation, were found. The period of time, 1600s, as I say, go to Norman Carlson. Don't use me for reference. We have trappers, we have hunters, we have military expeditions that come through for a moment. But the first thing that I have found to date in writing is the account of July 23rd, 24th, 25th as they traverse Chautauqua Lake. I thought maybe they tell us about Potamogeton crispus or curly-leaf pondweed or something like that. But they tell us nothing about, other than the fact that the hillsides were totally forested as far as their interpretation was concerned, and that there's contact with the Native Americans, and that's about it. As we have a hint, and I tried to get Mike Wilson from the College at Fredonia with me this spring to go up and look in the vicinity of the upper reaches of Chautauqua Creek at what I felt were interglacial trees that were laid down in the gravel, and then another glacier came along, or it grew and then were laid down by another glacier coming over them. However, when I went out to explore it, before I invited Mike to come up and make his interpretation, a beaver went in and built a dam, and I have 8 feet of water sitting on top of what I would consider my intercessional tree growth. Realize that when we are here and they are going down through the lake, I've got to jump all the way forward for a moment and tell you about the floodplain documents that are part of the Federal Flood Insurance Act of 1969. For in that document for the city of Jamestown, they have done a profile of the bottom of the outlet of the lake. And they show the profile from Dunham Avenue in Celeron all the way down past Main Street in Faulkner. The outlet of the lake drops about 53 feet through that area. And based on material and information that I have, I go back and look at the Warren report, or the Warren sketches of Chautauqua County, published in 1864, 1846. I've got a blank there for a moment. They talk about one year the lake was so dry in 1823 that they decided to dig the outlet deeper so that they could get water flowing to the mills that were along the outlet of the lake, and they encountered shale. Well, I can show you that shale above the 3rd Street Bridge at an elevation of 1,302.5 feet above mean sea level. That was a ledge, and it's still there. The Warner Dam is built downstream of that particular manifestation. So I would suggest to you that the Native Americans in Celeron, when they came, when the Celeron met the Native Americans in 1849, that Chautauqua Lake had a mean elevation of somewhere between 13.25 and 1,304 feet above mean sea level. In other words, somewhere between 4 and 6 feet shallower than you and I know it. If we can imagine 4 to 6 feet shallower than you and I know it today, all of a sudden many of the areas that are wetlands around the shores of the lake, even today, become dry land because of the change in elevation. And therefore, I can agree much more with the interpretation of what the archaeologists have given us. Realize that the archaeologists also suggest to us that on the Fardink Road in the town of North Harmony, above it is an Indian site. Another site with the construction of the Southern Tier Expressway suggests that these village sites were established with a lake elevation that may have been 20 or 30 feet higher than the elevation that we're looking at today. So we have that type of flow and conjecture dealing with that type of thing, and it'll take more sophisticated work than we've been able to put into it if we haven't destroyed too much of the evidence to this date in order to make that work out much better. When the archaeologists were doing the work coming down off of Midway Park, they walked the dirt paths of Midway Park and picked up artifacts in the paths. They didn't have to dig them. Stan Lance, who is a native of Chautauqua County and did much of the work for the Mellon Museum, said, "Look at this, I've got Lamokan polished stoneware, and it's lying right in the path up to the go-kart area. And no one is interested in it." And it was quite interesting. I was digging with Stan and others down here, and I was throwing stuff out of the pit, and I picked up a stone that to me was nothing, and I had it about there, and Stan grabbed it out of my hand. He says, "That's a blank." He says, that's a piece of stone that has been carried around to be made into an instrument." I said, "All right, I'll believe you, Stan." So we have that history throughout. There are other histories to deal with, but they're not well written. They're not specifically tied to Chautauqua County. They're not integrated well enough so that I can do anything with them. One of the things that we might look at to know more about Indian occupancy is to look at the original notes of the Holland Land Company. A copy of the set of the original notes of the Holland Land Company are in the county clerk's office in Mayville. You would have to train yourself to be able to read them, but they have detailed notes on the soils, the vegetation, Indian trails, and anything else that might be of interest to the Holland Land Company as they were promoting. Now realize when I talk about the Holland Land Company, I've jumped forward from 1874 to almost 1900. So we'll go into that at a later time. Suffice to say that the lake has been a human resource for at least 10,000 years. It's up to us to decide what the future of the lake is going to be in the next 200, 300, or 400 years. We mistreated it for a while until we understood what was going on, and we'll get into that in a later time when we talk about the lake as a hydrological system, and then as we talk about the lake as a biological system. 2 more minutes. Oh boy. Let's talk a moment about the weather of Chautauqua County. One of the things that you've got to understand is the influence of weather, and what we're dealing with here is the idea of how much precipitation we get annually. Based on some studies that I've personally done, we get 42 inches of rain on average in the watershed. And we're going to discuss later on what 42 inches of rain mean. But realize we're talking about this much rain on every square foot of the watershed, and that has an impact on the watershed. We'll also look at the fact that the watershed of Chautauqua Lake has 8 acres of watershed for every acre of surface area. If we look at the Great Lakes, they have 2.5 acres to 3 acres for every acre of surface area. The implication, we'll get into that in greater detail, but it plays an important role in what happens in the lake itself. The population of the lake went from roaming Indians of several centuries ago that came and used their village sites until the soil was exhausted, and then they would move to another site, to permanent settlements, where on a Saturday night we may have 10,000 people at Chautauqua Institution. We have some 1,600 people living here in Mayville on a year-round basis. What is their impact on the lake? Is it good? Is it bad? Can we ignore it? We'll talk about those things in several of the future presentations.